By Dave Meltzer, from the September 2, 2019 Observer newsletter. While Harley Race was a main event star for a quarter century, and one of the most respected wrestlers of his era, the key period of his career was from 1977 to 1981, as NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Race, because of the great job he had done in the 7-week run in 1973, when he won the title for the most unusual of reasons, came one vote shy from getting the title when Jack Brisco won it out at the end of 1975. Race got the title from Dory Funk Jr., because they were looking for a guy tough enough and respected enough that Funk Jr. wouldn't pull any shenanigans. While Funk Jr. had been a complete professional in his 4 years as champion, the uncertainty of the tractor accident that caused him to miss his scheduled title loss to Jack Brisco in Houston had thrown the alliance out of whack. While portrayed as a close brotherhood of the world's top promoters, and actually in one of its strongest periods in history, it was still an alliance that was always hanging by a thread. Promoters always had their own interests at heart and their own ways of doing business. Sam Muchnick, the NWA president and booker of the champion, was a sports guy and had a very strong view of what the world champion should be. He was fine with 60-minute draws and occasional non-title losses, or losses in tag team matches, but always wanted them kept under control. And in the end, the champion and championship had to be put over. It was the value and prestige of the championship that kept the alliance from falling apart. But after Funk Jr.'s injury, things got out of hand. The promoters who had dates on the champion were furious. Muchnick tried to book Brisco, the future champion, or Terry Funk, the champion's brother, to fulfill Dory's dates and lose to the local star, giving the future champion, Brisco, logical title defenses. But the timing of the accident made people want the belt off Funk Jr. Even Muchnick himself had talks with Vince McMahon Sr., his bringing in Bruno Sammartino at the time was a deal worked out through Vince McMahon Sr., with the idea that if the NWA was going to fall apart, he'd have his backup plan working with McMahon. Race was a calming influence. He gave the alliance great matches, and put over Brisco just as instructed. Plus, the value of the belt to a career in those days was enormous. Lou Thesz was old and largely retired, so there were only a few NWA champions left active: Pat O'Connor and Gene Kiniski, who were aging, Funk Jr., and Race. Race appearing on top in major shows as champion in Florida, Georgia, both Texas circuits that also included New Mexico, Oregon, British Columbia, Stampede Wrestling, and the Carolinas made him an instant superstar in all those places because of the prestige with that belt. Race was already the top star in his home territory, and a main eventer in St. Louis, the most important market for the NWA and arguably the first or second most important wrestling city in the country at the time, along with New York. He was also a major star in Japan prior to becoming champion, and the luster of the NWA title made him even bigger there. If you were ever the NWA champion, and you won at Japan, you were always protected in booking and would only be asked to lose to Giant Baba, and even then only rarely. During the nearly 4-year period between his 2 NWA title wins, he had multiple reigns as Missouri State Champion, considered by many as the top regional belt in the world, was brought into the Carolinas as the first U.S. champion, creating their top singles title to lose to Johnny Valentine, and then, after Valentine's career ended in a plane crash and they wanted the belt on Paul Jones, they brought in Race for the one-night tournament that set a record crowd, with Race losing in the finals. He held the Southern title in Florida, the Georgia title, the Mid-American title in Tennessee, and versions of the North American title in both Eastern and Western Canada. It elevated the regional title to have a former world champion and an international star holding it. And it even more so added to the credibility of whoever beat him, since by winning the title from the former champion, it made the area fans think that person was on a roll and could beat either Brisco or later Terry Funk when they came into town to defend the NWA belt. Race booked in Georgia for Jim Barnett when there were issues and they felt they needed a tough guy that nobody would mess with, either in the promotion or on the outside, around. In St. Louis, he was almost always in either the main event or a strong semi. It was Race and booker Pat O'Connor in St. Louis who infuriated Sam Muchnick when Race dropped the Central States title to O'Connor on January 28, 1972 at Kiel Auditorium, and then defended his title in his home territory as if the match never happened. This led Muchnick to create the Missouri State title, and even before he had the worldwide prestige of being NWA champion, he was chosen to be the first champion. After winning the world title, his holding the Missouri belt gave it prestige and made it considered the stepping stone belt for the world title, and when he wasn't world champion, he was almost always either champion or in contention for that title. He was the last champion when the St. Louis Wrestling Club folded in early 1986. But on the flip side, Race, Bob Geigel, O'Connor and Vern Gagne were partners in buying out a retiring Sam Muchnick for what was consistently one of the best wrestling markets anywhere. In making change, having the falling out with Larry Matezik, as well as having to compete with Vince McMahon and with both sides presenting a style of wrestling the locals didn't like, they rarely did well after early 1983, usually only for matches where Ric Flair defended the title against either Bruiser Brody or Kerry Von Erich. While Race, when St. Louis was hot, would complain about how conservative Mucknick was as promoter, trying to open it up to the wilder booking in the rest of the country. He was also the first to note that the alliance itself started going downhill when Mucknick resigned as president in 1975. Jim Barnett took over as booker. Mucknick felt he was insulted at an alliance meeting and quit as president. Others have said that the situation was more set up, that the others had created a situation to get Mucknick out, so they were no longer bound by his strict rules regarding the world title. The key was that Mucknick was supposed to get 2.5% of every gate as booker of the champion and NWA president. Barnett said he would take over, and since Barnett liked to play that he was rich, although he really never was, he took over booking the champion for free. For Barnett, he was at the time living high off a very profitable Georgia territory, and booking the champion gave him power, and forced all the other promoters to be friendly with him. What was notable, though, is that even as booker, the NWA would never officially make Barnett president, leaving that title to Jack Atkinson, Fritz Von Erich, Eddie Graham, or Bob Geigel during that period. Barnett was the booker of the champion, and the treasurer, meaning he also handled the money. Race losing the 4-3 vote to Terry Funk to take over after Brisco in 1975, led to a compromise promise after a near deadlock that was broken by Von Erich backing Funk, that when it was time for Funk to lose the title, Race would get it. When Funk asked out, a combination of trying to win his wife back and some knee issues, there was no debate on who the next guy would be. After beating Funk via Indian deathlock submission on February 6, 1977, in Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens, Race dominated the title over the next 4 years. With Barnett as booker, local promoters could do as they wanted. Under Mucknick, his mentality was the champion had to stay strong, but could do small things to elevate the local star. Under Barnett, it was fair game, promoters could do as they pleased. That meant the champion's job changed to putting over the local territory's wrestlers. He usually worked with babyfaces, and would get to beat the secondary babyfaces, and escape by the skin of his teeth against the top faces. Race was great for the role. His offense looked believable. He did state-of-the-art moves, trademark spots like gut wrenches, various forms of suplexes, the diving headbutt, a pile driver that was never a finisher, and his big move, the delayed vertical suplex. He moved just a tad slower than most, and visually came off as a tough guy who was slightly out of shape because of his body type. To some, that was a negative representation of the championship, but Race had a tough guy reputation that the alliance liked, and was a super worker. When they brought him in, they were guaranteed a level of match that would rarely be seen in their territory, particularly in the smaller territories. In addition, he spoke with such conviction in his voice that when he said the NWA title was the real world championship, and that nobody alive could beat him, he made it believable. He never outwardly complained, even in places where at times he'd be asked to carry guys who were nowhere near his level for 60 minutes, and make it look for the last 15 minutes that he was about to get beat. Race would emphasize that the championship he held was the only real title, claiming it dated back to 1905, or at other times simply saying the turn of the century. Even after being champion, he was sometimes joked at for taking it so seriously. One night he and Nick Bockwinkel went together to Ribera Steakhouse in Tokyo. As was the custom, they posed together for a photo on the wall and autographed it. Race signed his name and wrote 6-time Real World Champion. Bockwinkel, who was American Wrestling Alliance champion during Race's glory period, then signed the same photo with his name, and wrote 3-time Semi-Real World Champion. Race was reliable, but he also drank heavily, smoked heavily, didn't go to the gym, and there was a question about looking the part. Race is one of the great examples of the cycle of life in wrestling. When he was champion, many of the older wrestlers, particularly former champions like Luthez, were heavily critical of him, saying that the guy in the main event should have a better body than the guy in the front row buying the tickets. There was also the claim that he did too many moves, that he would use finishing holds and his babyface opponents would kick out of them. That he'd do pile drivers and suplexes in television matches and even the job guys would kick out. That his TV squash matches were more a demonstration of how many different big moves he could do in a few minutes and prostituted moves. And in particular his diving headbutt, the move that he popularized, made no logical sense. Of course, to the generation watching him, his style was the ultimate in realistic old-school wrestling. To those of his era, there were very few at his level. And that style the prior generation mocked became the prototype of what the next generation became. He could do more different things than anyone, had more cool moves, took great bumps for his opponents and had amazing durability. He's called himself a physical freak, noting he could work 6 or 7 long matches a week, fly all over the world, never train, smoke, drink, and would never get hurt. But his style was much slower, deliberate as it would be called, and he was able to work that style 300 times a year. He'd have his best matches in St. Louis, where he got his biggest paydays and his most fame, but would do so in what was generally called a rock-hard ring. Plus, if there was trouble in the bar, he'd take care of business. Many considered him the best in the business, and by being that, he deserved the world championship. Those from the next generation held him in the highest regard, and copied what they could from him. Many consider Ric Flair one of the greatest world champions ever. His role model as champion was Race, as Flair copied the same type of showing off all kinds of moves squash matches, the same knee drop to the prefrontal lobe and the delayed vertical suplex, throwing in the figure 4 because of Buddy Rogers. Flair would talk with conviction, putting over the NWA belt as the biggest prize in all of professional sports, which he learned from watching Race do the same. And as a teacher, he learned from his experience. Race was a huge bump taker and flyer, but as a teacher, would tell his students that the more you could do on the mat meant the longer your career would be, even though he himself was the perfect example of lasting longer than almost anyone in a top position worldwide by doing the opposite. Still, not all was always rosy. Paul Boesch hated Race and essentially pulled out of the NWA and began recognizing Bockwinkel as his area's world champion instead after Race twice no-showed major Houston events. Once was a miscommunication, Race thinking an afternoon show was an evening show. Boesch was furious. The second time, Race missing a shot because his son was in an amateur wrestling tournament he wanted to see, without contacting Boesch, was unforgivable. Houston was one of the largest and most successful NWA cities, and best paying. Fritz von Erich at one point came to Bockwinkel and asked him if he'd like to be NWA champion. Bockwinkel wasn't the worker Race was, although he wasn't far behind, but was a different and in some ways a better talker, but looked the part with his great physical genetics. Fritz said that Race was making $400,000 per year, which was likely an exaggeration. Bockwinkel called Barnett, who said that Race was doing about 350 matches a year for that money. Bockwinkel said that at the time he was making about $150,000 for 150 dates as American Wrestling Alliance champion, and able to have a normal life, and felt it wasn't worth it. It was the ability to keep that schedule without burning out that made Race such a long-lasting champion. Thesz wanted out every time he lost. Kiniski wanted out. Dory didn't want out, and did a great job for 4 years, but that was a long time. Brisco and Terry wanted out. Of the true touring world champions of that era, Race, Dory and Flair were the only ones who were both successful draws as champion, and were able to keep up the schedule without asking out. Of course, Race's career nearly ended before it started. He started doing carnival matches at 15. He was only 17 when his pregnant wife was killed in an auto accident on December 26, 1960. They were going to amputate his leg, but promoter Gus Karras, who carried a lot of weight in those parts, insisted the doctors not do it. He had 2 metal braces and 12 pins put in his forearm, and 4 metal pins put in his right knee. The talk was that the braces in his forearm gave him real-life one-punch knockout power. He was out of action 18 months before his career resumed. It's not known who was driving that car, but ever since that day, Race had a rule. No matter what, he would always drive. Even in his 50s as a legend, riding with the younger guys in his WCW managing days, you'd think he'd be in the back seat getting to rest of the road trips. But he insisted on driving. But even then, it was at rapid speeds, and always drinking. In his days as the mentor for Leon Vader White, White's job was to make sure that before Race was down with his beer, that he already opened the lid of the next beer. High speeds, long distances and heavy drinking did lead to accidents, and Race had his share, both in cars and boats. Some were serious. His being confined to a motorized wheelchair late in life was from injuries in a boating accident more than the decades of hard bumps and non-bump friendly rings. He was married a second time at 18, Sandra Jones, had a daughter. He married a third time at 19, to Christine. While he was married nearly 30 years, the split must have been bitter because he would not mention her by name in the autobiography. She had a bad reputation in Japan in particular. In the late 70s and early 80s there were cartoons in Japan about Harley Race, the tough world champion wrestler, who doubled as a henpecked husband. Shortly after they divorced, and his wrestling career was over, he married Beverly B.J. Race, the vice president of the Commerce Bank in Kansas City. She helped him create his own business, running his wrestling school and promoting his World League wrestling events, and it was a terrible blow to him when she passed away from pneumonia in 2009. His first outside territory was Tennessee, going there in October 1960. He used the name Jack Long as part of a brother tag team with Johnny Long, usually wrestling other brothers like Bobby and Don Fields, and Gino, and Tony Calza. He suffered a broken fibula in May, which ended his stay there. While the story is that he used that Jack Long name until Texas in late 1963, that story is inaccurate. He did work some as the Great Mortimer, but he was using the name Harley Race in the Central States from the start of his career. After September 1963, the only place he wasn't Harley Race was a 3-month run as an enhancement guy, Jack Long, for Roy Shire in San Francisco. Race wrestled for Mucknick for the first time on June 20, 1964, as a 20-year-old on Wrestling at the Chase. He worked the television semifinal, winning the first fall and losing the next two to local babyface Joe Tangaro. He came back on August 1 to Wrestling at the Chase, going to a draw with Angelo Poffo, the father of Randy Savage. On September 19, he went to a draw with Lorenzo Parenti, a very talented underneath babyface worker. That indicates Mucknick and booker Bobby Bruin saw potential in the 21-year-old. The week after, he started full-time in the American Wrestling Alliance in his tag team with Larry Hennig, where he became an instant star. The team was one of the building blocks of the promotion. Race and Hennig largely headlined as American Wrestling Alliance World Tag Team Champions, or top contender, working singles and tags with the top babyfaces in the Midwest from the fall of 1964 until late 1967, when Hennig tore his ACL. Race took Chris Markoff as his new partner, but in their first title defense on November 3, 1967, in Chicago, they dropped the belts to Wilbur Snyder and O'Connor. Race worked as a singles wrestler from there. He beat American Wrestling Alliance champion Vern Gagne in a non-title match on November 11, 1967, in a Minneapolis main event to make himself the top contender for the title. This led to the Thanksgiving show at the Auditorium, where he lost to Victor the Wrestling Bear. That actually only drew 4,951, but 2 days later in St. Paul he lost his title match in St. Paul, and another a few weeks later in Minneapolis that both drew more than 6,000. He worked with every top babyface in main events, from Gagne to the Crusher, Mighty Igor, Bill Watts, Bruiser, Rene Goulet, Rock Rogowski, who became Ole Anderson, Luke Brown and Pat O'Connor. In 1968 he made his debut in Japan with the old JWA, doing well, including teaming with Bruiser to lose to Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki in Osaka. When he returned, Hennig was back, and they did some teaming, but Gagne was running with Mitsu Arakawa and Dr. Moto Torquemada as his championship team, so Race and Hennig were there to lose and set up title challengers. Race had singles programs with Crusher and Watts, where he mostly put them over, and finished up at the end of 1968. He spent 5 weeks in Southern California to start 1969, and then went to West Texas, where he was used as headliner, with Terry Funk, Dory Funk Sr. and Ricky Romero as his main rivals. It was while wrestling in West Texas that Race, no longer full-time with Gagne, got his first match at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis on February 22, 1969, and to show how much they thought of him, he went to a draw with O'Connor, a protected former world champion, in a classic match. He was a high-on-the-card regular for the next 16 years. His first NWA World Title match appears to be a loss to Funk Jr. on April 16, 1969, in Lubbock. He faced him in a number of sites, including a 57-minute title match in El Paso, an early interaction with Dusty Rhodes, his greatest rival of his world title period, came in 1969 when the two became a regular heel tag team. In Amarillo they faced Terry Funk and Ricky Romero with Joe Louis as referee. In Odessa they lost with an overflow crowd to Romero and El Santo. On December 1, 1969, Race and world champ Dory Jr. formed a team and lost to Inoki and Michiaki Yoshimura. He worked occasional shots elsewhere, but his West Texas run ended in March 1970, when he came back to the Central States. He was almost immediately the top star in the territory, frequently holding the Central States title, and soon bought into the promotion. Race brought the Central States title to St. Louis on May 14, 1971, going to a double DQ with Bruiser, at the top the city's most popular wrestler. A rematch on August 20, 1971, was his first singles main event, with Race retaining the title via countout before a near sellout of 9,862 fans. Nearly selling out Kiel for a show without the world champion put Race solidly into the main event mix, and beating Bruiser, who was always protected, did so even more. He followed with a title defense over Cowboy Bob Ellis that drew 9,381 as the main event. This solidified that Race could draw on top, but also showed the value of a second championship belt in the market that historically only had a world title, and never a tag team title either. This led to his first world title match in St. Louis on October 1, 1971, drawing 10,106 and losing to Funk Jr. with Thez as referee. He followed with a double knockout in a title match with O'Connor before 9,110, and a win in a rematch before a sellout 11,912. Although he main event was Bruiser against Blackjack Lanza and Bobby Heenan in a handicap match. He beat Jerry Brisco to keep the title on November 19, 1971 at the arena before 12,614, as part of a promotion where both Brisco brothers were going for the singles titles, with a Dory Jr. 60-minute draw with Jack on top. The Central States title, with it headlining St. Louis and Race on a nearly one-year run, was becoming one of the biggest regional titles in the country. And then it fell apart. Race dropped the title to O'Connor at Wrestling at the Chase on January 15, 1972. The idea is O'Connor, the booker, thought it would draw bigger if he was champion and defended against Race, and using those two wins to build him for Funk Jr. But in the Central States region, they ignored this and Race kept defending it. The O'Connor vs. Race rematch drew 9,716 fans, and O'Connor retained. At the show, Muchnick found out that even though O'Connor had won the title in St. Louis, that Race was still defending it elsewhere. He dropped the Central States belt, even though it had become a proven draw. After a mess of a tournament that was making no sense, Muchnick ordered O'Connor to crown a champion, so on the September 16, 1972 episode of Wrestling at the Chase, Race beat Pac-Sun to become the first champion, and then 6 days later, Race made his first defense at Kiel Auditorium, beating Bruiser before 7,143 fans. He followed with wins over O'Connor and Archie the Stomper Gouldy, and a 60-minute draw with Johnny Valentine. Race losing via countout to Funk Jr. for the world title on January 5, 1973, drew an standing room crowd of 11,116, and drew a second sellout of 10,752 weeks later and losing the Missouri title to Valentine. After winning and losing the NWA title, Race and Jack Brisco worked rematches all over the world, including a 60-minute draw in Hiroshima, Japan. Baba, in his own booking, then beat Race to keep his PWF title, so that even though the NWA belt was the world belt, Baba looked to be at the level above them to set up his first win over Brisco. In St. Louis, they wanted to build Brisco vs. Race into a major event, with Race beating O'Connor, beating Kinniski to win the Missouri title, going to a 45-minute draw with Funk Jr. to keep it, beating Kinniski in a rematch, beating Black Angus Campbell to keep it, teaming with Bill Miller to beat Angus and Brisco and pinning Brisco in the third fall of the Chase match, and then teaming with Bob Orton Sr. to beat Bobo Brazil and O'Connor in a Chase match when pinning O'Connor. In all, Race had 6 matches with world champions, won 5 and drew 1, including a win over the champion. Everything looked set for a big event on January 4, 1974. Except a blizzard hit St. Louis. 2 storms in the weeks before the match each dropped more than 10 inches of snow. The advance was not good, but that was still a walk-up era. Then an ice storm was forecast and the crowd was only 7,390, with Brisco winning via DQ in the third fall when Race was disqualified by Ref O'Connor for throwing Brisco over the top rope. Race laid out Brisco in a TV angle with his suplex and choked Brisco with his own tie to set up a February 1, 1974 rematch that Brisco won clean before 9,479 fans with O'Connor as referee. Race had his famous 45-minute draw with Billy Robinson for the Missouri belt before 9,462 just 2 weeks later. Race vs. O'Connor in a Texas death match after Race blamed O'Connor for his losses to Brisco drew a sellout 10,854 on April 5, where the story was that O'Connor actually won 2 of the first 3 falls, so it was as if he'd have won a regular match, but the match continued until one person couldn't continue, and Race outlasted him. Race's Missouri title run ended on May 24, 1974, to Funk Jr., 1 year to the day of Race's win over Funk Jr. to take the NWA title. This was the period where the angle was with Race, Funk Jr., and Brisco. You had 3 world championship level guys, all of who could win on any given night. All over the country, they mixed and matched. Race spent 1975 almost on a world champion schedule, working mostly major cities, against the biggest names in the business in main events, like Brisco, Funk Jr., Bob Armstrong, Shos LeDuc, Haystacks Calhoun, Terry Funk, Jerry Brisco, Dusty Rhodes, O'Connor, Johnny Weaver, Johnny Valentine, Don Morocco, Bobo Brazil, Dick Slater, Edward Carpentier, Mr. Wrestling 2, Rocky Johnson, Andre the Giant, who would allow Race to body slam him, something he wouldn't let anyone else that year do, Cyclone Negro, Dick Murdoch, Bob Backlund, Jerry Lawler, Bruiser and others. He finished the year in Japan on a tour where he pinned Rhodes, drew with Baba and Funk Jr., and did double countouts with Abdullah the Butcher and Kentaro Oki. He was losing a lot in 1976, as it seemed they were setting up contenders for him when he was to win the title early the next year. People in that boat included Mark Lewin, Jack Brisco, Robinson, Backlund, Aguri Jr., Rhodes, Ricky Romero, Wahoo McDaniel, Wrestling 2, Mr. Wrestling and others. When he beat Funk in Toronto on February 6, 1977, they were all immediate contenders. Race worked almost every night, crisscrossing heat country, going to Japan and Australia, facing every major star in the business. In his first 2 months alone, he faced Jack Brisco, McDaniel, Mike Graham, superstar Billy Graham, Rhodes, Ron Fuller, Paul Jones, Bob Armstrong, Ernie Ladd, Sergeant Slaughter, Johnson, Ken Lucas, Chavo Guerrero, Wrestling 2, Moondog Mayne, Black Gordman, Watts, Baba, Ron Miller, Poffo, and Ken Patera. Then Ric Flair came into the picture, as did Ted DiBiase, Bruiser Brody, Buddy Rose, The Funks, Morocco, Dutch Savage, Andre Jimmy Snuka, Don Leo, Jonathan Kinniski, Rick Martel, Lawler, Steve Kieran, Pedro Morales, Ivan Koloff, Abdullah the Butcher, Dick Murdoch, and David Von Erich. Over the course of 8 days at the start of 1978, he had a match of the year 60-minute draw with Jumbo Tsuruta, finished his tour of Japan flying to Miami for another 60-minute match at the Orange Bowl in what was billed as the Super Bowl of Wrestling against Wwf Champion Billy Graham, and then went to San Francisco for the annual Cow Palace Battle Royal, as well as a win over Chavo Guerrero. The Graham match on January 25, 1978, was the first ever NWA vs. WWF Champion match in history, was one of the most notable of the era. Race went on the attack in the promos, saying he was the real world champion and everybody knew it, but in New York, there was a guy and fans who claimed a phony was champion. He said that he didn't need 22 inches of pumped up baloney to prove he was a man. It was announced there would be 2 referees, Gorilla Monsoon representing WWF and Don Curtis representing the NWA, and with the sports presentation it was brought up that both men were both accomplished pro wrestling stars but also college wrestling stars, and it would be a wrestling match with no shenanigans with the 2 champions. But the match was a disaster. They drew 12,000 fans, which was less than hoped for, due to a major downpour. Plus the compromise worked out much to Graham's chagrin, was a 60-minute draw. Graham was hardly a 60-minute wrestler indoors, let alone in a rainstorm. A rematch was set for February 23, 1978, at the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, Florida, but 3 days earlier, Backlund beat Graham in Madison Square Garden. The second Super Bowl of wrestling was somewhat better. The ending was the same, a 60-minute draw, but the match was a lot more entertaining. A third such match took place on October 29, 1978, in Orlando with Backlund vs. Race, also a 60-minute draw. Race went to Australia and New Zealand and had the first NWA title match ever at Arena Mexico on April 21, 1978, beating El Halcón. People like Ricky Steamboat, Blackjack Mulligan, Tony Atlas, Thunderbolt Patterson, Stan Hansen and Paul Orndorff emerged as leading contenders that year. While the Super Bowl matches got the national coverage within the business, a match talked about for decades took place in a medium-sized city against a local promoter and top babyface, who actually tried to steal the championship. The older promoters and wrestlers would talk about double crosses, but it was more than a decade since Kentaro Oki came after Luthez in Houston with shoot headbutts trying to win the title in a double cross, and ended up leaving on a stretcher. In wrestling folklore, Don the Lawman Slatton is best known for a May 10, 1978 match on a show he promoted in Abilene, where he faced Race for the NWA title in a chain match. Slatton was the local hero, since he booked himself as the star in his city, even with people like the Funks as regulars. In Amarillo, Terry Funk in the 60s was promoted as the king of the chain matches and in doing so, drew big crowds for those occasional bloodbaths. So Slatton did the same in Abilene. He was the king of the chain matches, billed locally as never having lost a chain match. Because he was facing Race under his rules, there was a big push that the hometown star was going to win the world title, and the crowd was way up from usual. Race's version of the story is that he got a phone call earlier in the day from Bob Geigel, the promoter in Kansas City, Race's home territory and Race's business partner at the time, asking if he was working with Slatton that night. When Race told him he was, Geigel told Race not to show up, saying he had been tipped off that Slatton was going to use the chain match rules of touching all 4 corners to try and steal the title. Race told Geigel not to worry because he was Harley Race. Some wrestlers might get double-crossed, but Race was one of the most feared real street fighters in the game, as opposed to Slatton, who was a tough guy in his youth. But he was in his mid-40s by that time and nobody messed in those days with Race. Race joked to Geigel that surely Slatton wouldn't be that stupid to try something like that on him. Race's version of the story is that the finish he got in the dressing room from the runners, usually the officials, who would go between the face and heel dressing room as in those days everyone was kept separate, was that Slatton would drag him to 3 corners, and be on the verge of winning, struggling to hit the 4th corner, when a heel would come out and distract Slatton, who would cost Slatton the match and the title, and lead to his next program. Terry Funk would then come out for the save, but in the commotion Race would knock Slatton out with the chain and touch all four corners to win. Everything was going as planned. The heel came out. Nobody involved seemed to be able to remember who it was. Given who was on the card, it would have been Roger Kirby, Mr. Pogo, or Jonathan Boyd, who for some reason that name rings a bell with this story, or Rip Hawk, who had been one of Slatton's biggest career rivals a few years earlier. Anyway, whoever it was came out, and Funk came out as well, but Slatton made sure there was slack in the chain and Race was unaware, and Slatton, instead of being distracted, touched the fourth corner. The place exploded. Slatton had just won the World Heavyweight Championship. He quickly took the chain off and rushed off to the dressing room, not even taking the belt with him, figuring being in the ring with Race in that situation in his hometown, where he was the local hero and had a reputation to uphold as a tough guy, was not the best idea. The fans were still celebrating and shocked, because Slatton was hardly a guy anyone expected to win the World Heavyweight Championship, even if this was his specialty match, and it was noted he had beaten Race under chain match rules several times when both were younger in the late 60s. The referee, a young Tongan former sumo wrestler just getting started and being trained for All Japan, using the name Tonga Fifita, who later became a star as Haku and Meng, was smart enough to know that the title wasn't changing hands that night. Even though Slatton was the guy paying him that night, he never signaled for the bell. Slatton was gone and Race, first making sure the inexperienced ref wasn't going to call the match, took off after him. Race's version of the story as told to people over the years is that he ran through the crowd, not even stopping to take the chain off, went to the babyface dressing room and found Slatton hiding in the shower. Race said he slapped him twice, dragged him to the ring and punched him a few times, and then dragged him around the ring, even though he no longer had the chain on, touching all four corners. Fifita then ordered for the bell and told the ring announcer to announce that Race, and not Slatton, was the winner, and still world champion. Some of the fans had left. The ones who hadn't couldn't figure out what they were just seeing. There had been no actual announcement made about Slatton winning since he and Race were both in the dressing room before the announcement could be made, and Fifita never made the call. In Race's book, King of the Ring, the story differed slightly, with Race saying that he got to Slatton before Slatton left the ring, that he started throwing real slaps and punches, and then dragged him around the ring, and Fifita called for the bell. Race in his book claimed he then went to the babyface dressing room, where he heard Slatton and Funk laughing, opened the door and started swinging the chain, smashed lockers and chairs while Slatton curled into a ball saying, "Please, Harley, don't hit me. Don't hit me. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." He claimed Funk then yelled at Slatton for trying to double-cross Race, but Race suggested that Funk may have been behind it from the beginning. In other versions, Race said that he went back to his own dressing room, but ended up so mad that he went back to the other side of the building. This time Slatton had locked the door, so Race kicked in the door. But Slatton was already gone, and he threw a few chairs against the wall, went back to his side of the building, then took his shower and went to the next town. Funk said he remembered the story, but what he remembered is that after Slatton double-crossed Race, that Race went to the dressing room, knocked down the door, and Slatton was pleading with Race not to punch him, saying he lost count and thought he was touching the third turnbuckle, and it was all a mistake. Race's version was also similar, saying Slatton lied through his teeth, claiming it was an accident. After screaming a steam of profanities at Slatton and kicking him a couple of times, "I let the poor bastard go." Funk said that Slatton always stuck to the story. To him it was an accident, although what happened next would suggest otherwise. Slatton had to know that he wasn't going to be declared world champion, no matter how well the double cross went. The next day, the local Abilene Reporter story, likely coming from Slatton, reported that the lawman had beaten the world champion, Race, but it had been changed to a non-title chain match. Slatton then purchased himself a belt and billed himself locally as the world chain match champion, and started defending it on his cards. His biggest show of the year a few months later had a triple main event of Andre the Giant versus the Sheik, Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk versus David and Kevin Von Erich for the Texas Tag Team titles, and the lawman defended his chain match championship against Abdullah the Butcher. In 1979, Race was back in the territory on a card with Slatton and saw a belt on the bench in the dressing room which read, "World Champion Chain Wrestler." He said Slatton walked in and Race took the belt and told Slatton, "You won't be needing this," and left with it. He said Slatton begged him not to take it because he spent a lot of money on it. By NWA bylaws, which could be ignored when convenient, no NWA promoter could bill someone as world champion who wasn't the recognized NWA champion. "There's no earthly reason for you to have this, and I'm not leaving here without it," Race claimed that he said to Slatton while taking the belt. "To this day, I don't remember what I did with the stupid belt. I just know Slatton never got it back." Race had a big year in St. Louis as champion. On January 6, he beat Bruiser before a near sellout of 10,500 even though the weather was so bad a lot of the talent couldn't make it and fans were told not to drive in that weather. On February 18, he went to a 60-minute draw with Rocky Johnson before 10,052 fans. On April 7, he beat Terry Funk before 9,450 fans, when after losing the first fall, he gave Funk 7 piledrivers before pinning him in the second fall and Funk couldn't answer the bell for the third fall. On June 16, he beat Murdoch before 6,586 fans. On August 11, he had a double countout with Bruiser before a sellout 10,804. On October 6, he beat Flair via countout before 9,130. On November 24, he beat DiBiase when after a 39-minute first fall, Race hit him with multiple piledrivers and DiBiase couldn't come out for the second fall before a near sellout 10,500. And finally, on December 8, he lost a non-title cage mock to Bruiser before 9,998. In the first week of 1979, he did a double countout with Andre at the Omni in Atlanta, a 60-minute draw with Terry Funk in Tampa, beat Jos LeDuc in Miami Beach, beat Bruiser via countout before 9,812 in St. Louis and then did double countouts with Andre and Kevin Von Erich in Houston and Dallas. But every week was a big week. He had a week where Friday he beat Flair in St. Louis, flew to New Zealand for a series of matches with Peter Maivia, followed up on a Wednesday with Maivia in Honolulu, and then flew to Greensboro for another match with Flair. Another week saw him in Pearl Harbor against Maivia, Amarillo the next day with Murdoch, Houston the day after with the Spoiler, St. Petersburg the next day going 60-minute at the Bayfront Center with Rhodes and back to Houston for a double count out with Andre. Another 3-day stretch saw consecutive draws with Baba, Surita, and Murdoch. His first title defense against Hulk Hogan, then Terry the Hulk Boulder, was June when in Dothan, Alabama. Perhaps the most monumental angle of that year was in St. Louis, but was just as big when it played on television in Texas. On May 20th, on Wrestling of the Chase, Fritz Von Erich, who returned 2 nights earlier to St. Louis for the first time in 20 years, laid out an angle. Larry Matuzik explained it like this: "It was my impression also that Fritz felt his sons were being held back in St. Louis by O'Connor as booker. Thus, Fritz got to have the rush of teaming in St. Louis with his boys and also talking in person with his old buddy, Sam Mucknick. When Sam was on board, and Sam always liked to give young talent a push, O'Connor got right on the bandwagon. On May 18th, Fritz took me aside in the dressing room and laid out the entire idea. It really wasn't anything that had not been done before in handicap matches, except that this time it would involve the NWA champion. The bout itself told a great story about the young challenger, David Von Erich, and Race was most generous in making the Iron Claw something very special once again. Blood didn't happen often on television, but, in this case, Harley left a bucketful on the mat. This rivalry had legs at the box office and Fritz was indeed correct about the box office potential of his charismatic son. The idea looked to set up Race versus Fritz, with David as the sacrificial lamb. But it went differently. It was a handicap match where Race vowed to beat both Fritz and David, thus removing them as contenders at the same time. It wasn't a 2-on-1 but 2 matches, Race versus David, who at the time was 21 and been a mid-card tag team guy in St. Louis, and after Race won, as everyone expected, he then faced Fritz, which was the big match. Race was having his way with David and came off the top rope for his diving headbutt. David caught him with the claw. Everyone expected Race would get out. But he didn't. Then Race was covered in blood. They still expected him to get out. Then David pinned him. The place exploded. Fritz never even got into the match. David became an instant attraction in St. Louis, and suddenly, with David and his brothers, Kevin and Kerry, to go along with Flair and DiBiase as younger talent women, particularly teenage girls, joined the traditional audience that guys like Race, Bruiser, Brody and others were bringing in. It was the start of a several-year boom period in St. Louis. When the tape played in Texas, David and Race became a big attraction there as well, which led to the territory drawing big with Race, and later Flair, coming in against any of the 3 brothers. At first it was just an angle for a match, for Race to go over. And he did on June 15th, but they sold out 11,000 tickets at Kiel Auditorium, and David, a mid-level guy a month earlier, was now a significant main event star. On December 7th, Kevin and David beat Race and Murdoch, when David once again beat Race with a claw in the third fall. This set up a January 4, 1980, show where Race drew David over 60 minutes and Kevin retained the Missouri State title with a double DQ with Murdoch before a sellout 11,055 fans. Also in 1979, Race did 2 quickie title changes. Rhodes had been constantly chasing the NWA title in Florida since Terry Funk beat Brisco. It was similar in some ways, and different in others, from Briscoe's 1970 to 1973 chase of Funk Jr., but this was going on close to 4 years, with countless matches with Terry Funk and Race in every city, with every finish imaginable to both not have Rhodes lose, but not have him win either. Rhodes beat Race on August 21, 1979, at the Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa. To save face, Eddie Graham came up with the idea that Terry Funk, Rhodes' arch-rival, who was not even in the territory, would show up 5 days later to the rematch at the Eddie Graham Sports Stadium in Orlando. Funk attacked Rhodes and broke his arm before the match. Still, Rhodes refused to let down the fans, and defended his title with a broken arm, but Race beat him to win it back. On October 31, Baba pinned Race to win the title in Nagoya, beat him in a rematch on November 5, but lost it back on November 7. The next year was more of the same. One of his biggest matches, billed as The Last Tangle in Tampa, taken from the movie named The Last Tango in Paris. It was held at Tampa Stadium on August 3, 1980, before 17,833 fans, setting a Southeastern record with a $160,000 gate. It was Race versus Rhodes, 2 of 3 falls, with Fritz von Erich, the NWA president, as referee. Rhodes won the only fall in 34 minutes, as they went the full 60. The rules were in a 2 of 3 fall match. The challenger had to win 2 falls, so Race retained. Baba purchased himself another 1-week run, with his going price of $25,000, winning on September 4 in Saga and losing it back on September 10 in Atsu. Newer stars such as Tommy Rich, Gino Hernandez and Barry Windham were becoming top challengers. Race had become the first NWA champion to defend his title in Madison Square Garden since the Buddy Rogers fallout in 1963. Vince McMahon rejoined the NWA in 1971 and, unlike Bruno Sammartino, was called Wwwf World Champion. Pedro Morales was just Wwwf Champion. Dory Funk Jr. was World Champion, but McMahon never wanted to confuse the issue or acknowledge there was another World Champion, even though he did bring in Vern Gagne as American Wrestling Alliance Champion in the early 70s. The program sold in the buildings listed Backlund as WWF Champion and Race above him as World Champion, but Race was never mentioned on television. Race came to Madison Square Garden first, for a title defense in a mid-level bout over Tony Garea on December 16, 1978. He came back on April 30, 1979 to MSG and beat Steve Travis. On December 17, 1979, he beat Rhodes via blood stoppage on a loaded show that was also taped for New Japan Television. The Backlund vs. Race title match took place on September 22, 1980, in a sold-out MSG, with Backlund winning via DQ in 35-14. A rematch on November 7, 1980, took place in St. Louis at Kiel Auditorium, with Race winning via third fall DQ before 7,986 fans. Even though Backlund got his first break in St. Louis, and regularly defended the WWF title there, the new fanbase wasn't into title versus title. Race's previous defense in St. Louis against David Von Erich drew 15,464 at the Checkerdome, and broke the city's all-time record gate. Race vs. Backlund title was not only the lowest drawing race match in the city in 1980, but many shows without title matches were headlined by the Missouri Belt, outdrew it. Race's big run continued in 1981, including being in the last match Roy Shire would ever promote on January 24 at the Cow Palace against Pat Patterson. On June 12, a Race vs. DiBiase match at the Checkerdome drew 16,088 fans, once again breaking the city's gate record. On June 21, at the Omni in Atlanta, Rhodes pinned Race with a crossbody off the top rope, and Atlanta finally got its first elusive world title change. On September 11, 1981, business was so strong and Kerry Von Erich was becoming so big of a star that a non-title match with he and Race sold out Kiel with 10,985 fans. Kerry was still very green and was a year away from becoming the true top draw he would become. Still, Race won the match, which made sense at the time. After Flair beat Rhodes to win the NWA title, his first St. Louis defense was October 2 against Race, which broke the gate record once again, selling out the Checkerdome with 18,055 fans for a 60-minute draw. They weren't rematched until October 8, 1982, which drew 17,002 fans, for a match where Race won one fall in a 2 out of 3 match, thus didn't get the title. Fast forward 3 years and a Flair vs. Race match at Kiel Auditorium drew barely 1,000 fans. Race did put Kerry over clean at Texas Stadium to help build Kerry for his area matches with Flair. But when it was time, in 1983, for him to drop the Missouri State title to Kerry, he would only do it with the stipulation that the title could change hands via DQ. He had seen Brisco be used for years to get the new stars over and refused, as a part owner, to be like Brisco in his best city. Race held both the Missouri State title and the Central States title when he beat Flair on June 10, 1983, for his last major world title run in St. Louis. His run was successful. A week later, before an advanced sellout of 18,000 fans at Reunion Arena in Dallas, fans expected Flair versus Kevin Von Erich, but were shocked to see Race coming down the aisle as the new champion. Race and Flair drew big all over the Carolinas, and even bigger in Toronto. A July 10, 1983 rematch drew 20,703 fans to Exhibition Stadium and set the country's all-time record gate of $239,000, with Race losing via DQ. They came back 2 weeks later and drew another 11,000 fans, with Flair losing via DQ with the famed dusty finish. In July, Race said he would never face Flair again, and put up the bounty, although they did 2 big houses after that in Richmond. An October 8, 1983 match in St. Louis, with Hogan vs. Race, was notable as the first NWA title match in the city that has 1 fall, instead of 2 out of 3, since Hogan wouldn't lose a fall. St. Louis was pretty much the last holdover of the 3-fall World Championship matches. Flair beat Race on November 24, 1983, at the first Starrcade at the Greensboro Coliseum. Race mostly worked in his home territory, but did a lot of rematches with Flair all over the country, including once at the Meadowlands. The final title reign saw Race beat Flair on March 21, 1984, in Wellington, New Zealand. Race won the rematch the next day in Auckland, but then lost the title back on March 23, 1984, for the final time, in Kalong, Singapore. He also beat Flair on May 22 in Tokyo, during the brief Kerry Von Erich NWA title reign, setting up a DDQ in a title match 3 days later, the day after Flair beat Kerry in Japan. Race went to the WWF in 1986, quickly became the king, and left in early 1989. He did work in Japan in 1989 and Puerto Rico in 1990, and did a number of WCW matches that year as well. It appeared his career ended on December 6, 1990, in Sioux City, Iowa, losing to Michael Wallstreet, Mike Rotunda. But due to an injury to Vader, he came back for 3 matches with Flair in 1993, ending his career with a DQ loss at the Jacksonville Coliseum on November 28. Harley Race. Career title history. NWA World Heavyweight, Def. Dory Funk Jr. May 24, 1973 Kansas City, lost to Jack Brisco July 20, 1973 Houston, Def. Terry Funk February 6, 1977 Toronto, lost to Dusty Rhodes August 21, 1979 Tampa, Def. Dusty Rhodes August 26, 1979 Orlando, lost to Giant Baba October 31, 1979 Nagoya, Def. Giant Baba November 7, 1979 Amagasaki, lost to Giant Baba September 4, 1980 Saga, Def. Giant Baba September 9, 1980 Atsu, lost to Tommy Rich April 27, 1981 Augusta, Georgia, Def. Tommy Rich May 1, 1981 Gaines, Georgia, lost to Dusty Rhodes June 21, 1981 Atlanta, Def. Ric Flair June 10, 1983 St. Louis, lost to Ric Flair November 24, 1983 Greensboro, Def. Ric Flair March 20, 1984 Wellington, New Zealand, lost to Ric Flair March 22, 1984 Kalong, Singapore. PWF Heavyweight, Def. Giant Baba October 28, 1982 Obihiro, lost to Giant Baba February 11, 1983 St. Louis. NWA United National Heavyweight, Def. Jumbo Tsuruta August 1, 1982 Tokyo, lost to Jumbo Tsuruta October 24, 1982 Kitami. NWA Missouri State Heavyweight, Def. Pak Song in tournament to become champion September 16, 1972 St. Louis, title held up after December 16, 1972 match with Johnny Valentine St. Louis, lost to Johnny Valentine January 19, 1973 St. Louis, Def. Gene Kiniski October 13, 1973 St. Louis, lost to Dory Funk Jr. May 24, 1974 St. Louis, Def. Dory Funk Jr. February 21, 1975 St. Louis, lost to Bob Backlund April 23, 1976 St. Louis, Def. Dick the Bruiser September 17, 1982 St. Louis, lost to Kerry Von Erich January 23, 1983 St. Louis, Def. Crusher Jerry Blackwell May 13, 1983 St. Louis, vacated title when winning NWA World Heavyweight title June 10, 1983, Def. David Von Erich January 6, 1984 St. Louis, lost to Crusher Jerry Blackwell November 16, 1984 St. Louis, Def. Crusher Jerry Blackwell August 2, 1985 St. Louis, St. Louis Wrestling Club folds February 1986. NWA United States Heavyweight, Carolinas version which became WCW and WWE version, Def. Johnny Weaver January 1, 1975 Tallahassee in a fictitious match to become the first champion in the territory, lost to Johnny Valentine July 3, 1975 Greensboro. American Wrestling Alliance World Tag Team with Larry Hennig Def. Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher January 30, 1965 Minneapolis, lost to the Crusher and Vern Gagne July 24, 1965 Minneapolis, with Larry Hennig Def. The Crusher and Vern Gagne August 7, 1965 Minneapolis, lost to Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher May 28, 1966 Minneapolis, with Larry Hennig Def. Dick the Bruiser and the Crusher January 6, 1967 Chicago, Hennig suffers torn ACL November 1, 1967 Winnipeg, replaced on team by Chris Markoff, lost to Wilbur Snyder and Pat O'Connor November 10, 1967 Chicago. EVA World Tag Team with Larry Hennig first champions when belts were introduced in 1966. Based on American Wrestling Alliance Tag Team Championship reign, lost to Dominic DeNucci and Mark Lewin July 1, 1966 Sydney. WWA World Heavyweight, Def. Bobo Brazil April 24, 1982 Indianapolis. Vacated title leaving territory July 1982. NWA Southern Heavyweight, Def. Killer Carl Krupp August 25, 1975 West Palm Beach, lost to Dusty Rhodes September 15, 1975 West Palm Beach, Def. Dusty Rhodes September 23, 1975, lost to Jerry Brisco November 1975. NWA Florida Tag Team with Roger Kirby Def. Johnny Weaver and Dick Slater April 16, 1975, vacated title when leaving the territory July 14, 1975. NWA Georgia Heavyweight, Def. Mr. Wrestling 2 September 13, 1974 Atlanta, lost to Don Morocco September 21, 1974. NWA Macon Tag Team with Buddy Colt Def. Gene and Ole Anderson November 12, 1974 in Macon, lost to Rocky Johnson and Danny Little Bear December 3, 1974 Macon. WWC Caribbean Heavyweight, Miguel Perez Jr. January 6, 1990 in San Juan, lost to Invader I March 4, 1990 Mayaguez. NWA U.S. Central States Heavyweight, Def. Sonny Myers April 5, 1968 St. Joseph, lost to Ronnie Etchison May 3, 1968 St. Joseph, Def. Danny Little Bear June 19, 1970 St. Joseph, lost to Danny Little Bear June 26, 1970 St. Joseph, Def. Bob Geigel January 21, 1971 Kansas City, lost to Pat O'Connor January 15, 1972 St. Louis, title change not recognized in Central States region where Race continued to defend it, lost to Danny Little Bear February 11, 1972 St. Joseph, Def. The Stomper Archie Gouldy July 7, 1972 Kansas City, lost to Omar Atlas November 24, 1972 St. Joseph, Def. Bulldog Bob Brown September 22, 1973 Kansas City, lost to Bulldog Bob Brown October 11, 1973 Kansas City, Def. Don Fargo June 29, 1974 Kansas City, lost to Don Fargo July 1974, Def. Bulldog Bob Brown July 11, 1974 Kansas City, lost to Bulldog Bob Brown August 1, 1974 Kansas City, Def. Bulldog Bob Brown July 8, 1976 Kansas City, lost to Bulldog Bob Brown September 1, 1976 Wichita, Def. Dewey Missing Link Robertson June 2, 1983 Kansas City, vacated belt June 10, 1983 when winning NWA World Heavyweight title, Def. Hacksaw Higgins October 25, 1984 Kansas City, lost to Mr. Pogo January 10, 1985 Kansas City. NWA World Tag Team, Central States, with Pat O'Connor Def. Bulldog Bob Brown and Mitsu Ohata December 16, 1976, lost to Bulldog Bob Brown and Mitsu Ohata January 16, 1977 Cedar Rapids. NWA North American Tag Team, Central States, with Baron Von Rasch Def. Bob Geigel and the Stomper Archie Gouldy April 30, 1970 Kansas City, lost to Rufus R. Jones and Danny Little Bear September 10, 1970 Kansas City, with Baron Von Rasch Def. Rufus R. Jones and Danny Little Bear October 5, 1970, lost to Rufus R. Jones and the Stomper October 29, 1970 Kansas City, with Roger Kirby Def. Rufus R. Jones and the Stomper November 2, 1972 Kansas City, lost to Rufus R. Jones and Bob Geigel February 1, 1973 Kansas City. NWA World Tag Team West Texas/New Mexico/Colorado, with Larry Hennig arrived as champions 1967 based on being American Wrestling Alliance Tag Team Champions, lost to Bearcat Wright and Thunderbolt Patterson June 26, 1967 Denver. NWA Mid-American Heavyweight, Def. Crazy Luke Graham September 1975, lost to Magnificent Zulu September 1975, Def. Magnificent Zulu September 9, 1975 Memphis lost to Bob Armstrong October 13, 1975 Memphis, Def. Coco Beware October 7, 1985 Memphis, lost title November 1985 in fictitious match with Tom Branch. NWA North American Heavyweight, Western Canada, Def. Archie Gouldy February 22, 1974 Calgary, lost to Archie Gouldy March 8, 1974 Calgary. NWA North American Heavyweight, Eastern Canada, Def. The Stomper Archie Gouldy May 7, 1974, lost to Leo Burke 1974. 1975 All Japan Open Tournament, 13th place. 1981 Real World Tag League with Larry Hennig, 5th place. 1982 Real World Tag League with Dick Slater, 4th place. 1984 Real World Tag League with Nick Bockwinkel, tied for 2nd place. 1985 Real World Tag League with Jesse Barr, tied for 2nd place. 1986 WWE King of the Ring winner. 1986 Sam Mucknick Memorial Tournament winner. Wrestling Observer Awards. 1980 Wrestler of the Year. 1981 Wrestler of the Year. 1983 Match of the Year, versus Ric Flair, November 24, Greensboro. Tokyo Sports Awards. 1978 Match of the Year, versus Jumbo Tsuruta, January 20, Obihiro. Pro Wrestling Illustrated Awards. 1973 Match of the Year, versus Dory Funk Jr., May 24, Kansas City. 1979 Wrestler of the Year. 1979 Match of the Year, versus Dusty Rhodes, August 21, Tampa. 1983 Wrestler of the Year. 1983 Match of the Year, versus Ric Flair, June 10, St. Louis. World Championship Wrestling Hall of Fame, 1994. Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, 1996. Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, 2004. WWE Hall of Fame, 2004. Trago/Thez Hall of Fame, 2005. NWA Hall of Fame, 2005. Iron Mike Mazurki Award from Cauliflower Alley Club, 2006. Stanley Weston Award, 2006. St. Louis Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, 2007. Stampede Wrestling Hall of Fame. Missouri Sports Hall of Fame, 2013. Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, 2017 Tag Team with Larry Hennig.